it did not surprise me. My heart was fully prepared. Matter of fact, I went
Saskatoon is where the revival
took place in Canada, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan.
Right.
But the year before, Duncan Campbell, the great revivalist of Scotland, had been there. And Bill McLeod had talked to me about that and said that Duncan Campbell had indicated he's not given to revival. But he said last night God gave him a vision of revival fires breaking out all across Canada from coast to coast. And then he told Bill, he said, when it will be, I do not know. But that it will be, I have no question. That became a huge motivation for me to go to Saskatoon, even though the little church just had 10 members and had been so discouraged they wanted to just quit. And but God said to my heart, me plus one is all I need to bring a mighty movement of God. So for a year and a half I prayed with Bill and others until that moment when there was a huge touch of God.
What happened?
Well, Bill called me and said, Henry, that for which we've been praying has begun. But that year and a half of praying together cleansed my heart. And as a pastor, I took everything God was doing in me and shared it with the congregation that I was pastoring. And they began to find their lives moving from where we were into a very focused relationship to God, not knowing all that He may have in mind, but knowing that it was right, that God has a right to our life, and we had not given it to Him. But when that moment came, Bill said suddenly his church was crowded, and we had to move to St. Timothy's Anglican Church that seated 3 times what his did, and one night it was crowded out.
Wow.
So we went to the University Drive Alliance Church that seated 900. It was crowded out. We went down to the 3rd Avenue United Church, seated 1,500. And every night for 7.5 weeks there was a mighty outpouring of God. And literally thousands of lives were touched. The moment which they called afterglow, when God's people were under such conviction of their sin, they had to repent. Those meetings would last to 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 in the morning. And so many were repenting that we had to have several locations for that to happen. Well, I had the privilege of not only being there ahead of time, going through that time, but I stayed 10 years afterwards.
Wow.
To see the impact of what God had in mind. And for instance, I just know our little church that had never started a new church, a mission church. Over the next few years, we started 38 new congregations.
Wow.
It came from a heart that was now adjusted to God. And the heart of God was, there were hundreds of towns and villages had no evangelical witness. But nobody had a heart to go reach them. Until God touched our heart, everywhere we looked, we saw need and saw people begging us, would you come and start a work here? Then we needed laborers. But our church had never reached out to university students, but I baptized in that time 180 university students, and 100 felt called into the ministry. So in our church we started a whole theological college just to train them. So from that touch of God where my life was cleansed and our church was cleansed, we became in a way a center of God's activity to take the gospel to scores of villages, to native Indian reserves, and then to raise up leaders.
You know, as you're sharing that, one of the thoughts that just kind of came into my mind and heart was, just as you sat here and told me of your family history from Spurgeon's College on down, and the revival there, that 3-4 generations from now, if the Lord tarries, that there may be someone sitting in a interview like this saying, I went to this college and Bible study and Bible school, and it was the result of a great revival that took place. I have a heritage of revival. I can just see 3 or 4 generations down that taking place. Let me back up and ask one other question that's again of interest to me, and I'm not sure I've worked through all of this yet myself, but okay, there were a group of pastors that were meeting together in prayer. Is that correct? What role does the pastor play in such a move? Does it have to be pastors meeting? Can it be lay people meeting? Because we hear of some times where it's been some lay persons meeting together and seeking the face of God. But I have a deep conviction if the pastor's not involved, it's going to be very difficult. But that doesn't always match up with what history has said. So, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I've never tried to read the books of men to find out what happened sometime else. I watch very carefully to see what God is doing where I am at that moment. And it happened to be that he pulled several pastors together. It was amazing to me to watch the full circle because there were a number of pastors who wouldn't join that group. And when the mighty movement of God came, the ones who had been involved in praying, their churches were profoundly touched and moved of God. But those pastors who didn't pray, they left the ministry. They were forced out of their pastorate. Their churches went through turmoil. And I would say, in any community, it is critically important that pastors have one heart and one mind. Not just a solitary pastor with his church.
Right.
But there's got to be a bonding of God's leaders. Because when God moves, he's going to move across every church and every tradition. But he will move with those whose hearts are ready, but those hearts are already bonded together. So in that time that I was experiencing, there was no sense of competition. There was no sense except a huge harmony and fellowship and a sense of joy and a sense of power right across everybody.
Would you say, and I'm not trying to get you to say, I'm just asking, would you say this? Would you say that the John 17 prayer, that as y'all aligned with that, were as pastors and in a spirit of unity, that released the glory of God?
We can look back and say that's what God did.
Yeah.
When Jesus prayed, he prayed there'd be one in us. Now we always say one with each other. Well, that's true, but the oneness comes in a relationship to the Father and the Son. It's like 1 John, where John says, truly our koinonia fellowship is with the Father and with the Son. If we walk in the light as he is in the light, we'll have that same koinonia fellowship one with another. And that's what we saw.